for stopping financial support from my parents after learning my money paid for their duplex? I'm Daisy, 39. My husband Ben is 40, and we've been married for 10 years. We have an 8-year-old daughter, Nora. My younger brother Spencer is 35. For most of my adult life, I've been the person in my family who gets called when a sentence starts with, "We're a little short this month." That didn't start because my parents were irresponsible or because Spencer was some lifelong disaster. 11 years ago, my dad, Malcolm, had a serious health setback. He was 57 at the time, and for a while it cut into his income. My mom, Irene, was working with what they had, but they still had a mortgage, medical bills were stacking up, and their savings were dwindling quickly. I was 28. Ben and I were serious then but not yet married. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table with a legal pad while Dad kept saying they would figure it out. Mom looked embarrassed just talking about the numbers. At one point she said, "We are not taking money from our daughter." I said, "You're not taking it. I'm offering." I could afford to help. It wasn't painless, but it was manageable. So I offered $1,800 a month. Dad called me after the first transfer went through and thanked me 3 separate times during the same conversation. Mom mailed me a birthday card a few months later with a handwritten note that said they would never forget what I was doing for them. At one point, when Dad was doing a little better, Mom actually tried to start sending me $200 back every month. I stopped her. I told her to keep it until they were steady. That phrase became important later. Around that same time, Ben asked me, "How long are you planning to do this?" I said, "Until they're steady again." And I meant it. For the first few years, I had no reason to doubt what the money was for. Dad would mention a specialist bill. Mom would talk about the mortgage and insurance. Sometimes they would say they had finally caught up on something they had been worried about. The need was real. 3 years in, Mom called me and said their medical and housing expenses were still going up. She sounded tired. She said they were doing better than they had been, but not enough to actually get ahead. I increased the transfer to $2,800 a month. Ben didn't tell me not to. He did ask whether my parents had shown me a budget. I remember getting defensive immediately. "They're my parents, not a business account." He said, "I didn't say they were. You're asking me to audit them. I'm asking if you know what problem the extra $1,000 is solving." I told him they would be humiliated if I demanded receipts every month, and he dropped it. In hindsight, I treated any question about the money as if it were a question about whether I loved my parents enough. That was my mistake. By the time Ben and I got married, the transfer was routine. By the time Nora was born, it was so routine that it went out of my account with less thought than the electric bill. That didn't mean it had no effect on us. When Nora was a baby, I brought up reducing the amount by $500 a month. Not stopping it. Just reducing it so Ben and I could build up savings a little faster. Mom said, "We wouldn't ask if we had another choice." So I left it alone. There were vacations we postponed. There was a repair at our own house that we delayed longer than we should have. None of those things ruined our lives. We were fine. That was part of the problem. Because we were fine, I kept telling myself the money wasn't hurting us enough to justify making my parents uncomfortable. Spencer was different. I don't mean that as an insult. He had periods where money seemed to slide through his hands faster than it came in. He wasn't unemployed all the time or living on my parents' couch. He was just less stable. My parents helped him with a rental deposit once. They covered him for a few months during another rough stretch. Everybody knew Spencer got rescued more often than I did. But he was also my brother, and he had done good things for me. He helped us move once when Ben hurt his back. He watched Nora during a family emergency when we were stuck. He even sided with me during an argument with Mom years ago when it would have been easier for him to stay out of it. So I never saw him as some villain living off everyone else. I saw him as the kid my parents worried about. I was the one they didn't worry about. About 6 years ago, my Aunt Celia, Mom's younger sister, said something that should have landed harder than it did. We were cleaning up after a family meal and she said, "At least your parents don't have that mortgage hanging over them anymore." I looked at her and said, "What?" She paused, then said something like, "I thought Irene told you." Mom walked into the room right then, and the conversation shifted. I honestly assumed Celia was confused, maybe talking about a refinance or something. I didn't follow up. That is one of those moments I replay now because it was such an easy question to ask. I just didn't ask it. Around 5 years ago, Spencer announced that he had bought a duplex. He was proud of it and I was happy for him. He told me he would live in one unit and rent out the other. He said Mom and Dad had helped a little with the down payment. I assumed that meant a few $1,000s. Maybe 10. Nobody said $75,000. Over the next few years, Spencer would mention my tenant, or complain about repairs, vacancies, insurance, or some appliance that had died. Once, after the rental unit had been empty for a couple of months, he said, "When that unit sits empty, it hits everybody." Then he corrected himself immediately. I mean, it hits me. I noticed it because it was a weird thing to say, but I didn't attach much meaning to it. 2 years before Mom's birthday dinner, I tried again to reduce what I was sending my parents. Ben and I wanted to increase savings and take care of something at home that we had been putting off. Mom said they were still barely keeping up with housing. That word choice matters now. She didn't say mortgage. She said housing. I asked whether maybe I could pay 1 or 2 bills directly for a while, just so we could see where the pressure actually was. Dad didn't like that idea. He said, "That makes us feel like children." So I kept sending the cash. Ben stopped asking about it after that. At the time, I thought he had accepted my position. What I learned later was that he had simply decided arguing with me about it was pointless. The birthday dinner happened at my parents' house. It wasn't a huge event. Just close family, some food, cake, and the usual amount of talking over each other. At some point, Mom asked me to grab extra dessert plates from the kitchen. As I came down the hall, I heard Spencer say something quietly to her. I couldn't hear the first part, only his last sentence. "So next month is still fine?" Mom answered, "Don't worry. Her money covers the duplex too." I stopped. I wish I could say I had some dramatic physical reaction, but mostly I just stood there holding a stack of paper plates, trying to decide whether I had heard correctly. Then Spencer said, "I just didn't know if the transfer date changed." Mom said, "It hasn't changed in years." That was enough. I walked into the kitchen. They both looked at me. Mom smiled too quickly and asked, "Find the plates." I said, "Yep." I didn't confront either of them. I went to the bathroom, opened my banking app, and canceled the next scheduled transfer. I didn't pull money back from their account. I didn't reverse anything they already had. I simply stopped the $2,800 that was scheduled to leave mine in a few days. Then I went back to the table. Ben knew something was wrong because I barely said anything through cake. I told him I wanted to go home early, and he didn't push until Nora was asleep. I told him exactly what I had heard. He stared at me for a second and said, "The duplex." That's what she said. Spencer's duplex? I assumed so. Did you ask? No. He looked surprised by that. I said, "I canceled the transfer." That got a longer pause. Okay. I was almost irritated by how calm he was. "That's all you're going to say?" He said, "I have a lot to say. I don't think tonight is when I should say it." Mom texted me before bed. "Are you upset about something?" I didn't answer. Dad called the next morning earlier than he normally would. Picked up. He didn't say hello. He said, "What exactly did you hear last night?" That question told me more than an apology would have. I said, "Whose duplex?" He went quiet. Then he said, "Why did you cancel the transfer?" "Whose duplex?" Daisy, this is not a conversation to have when you're angry. I'm not yelling. You heard one sentence out of context. What exactly is the context where my money covers a duplex? He exhaled hard. Then he asked, "How did you find out whose name is on the deed?" I hadn't. "Not yet," I said. "So there is a deed I should be looking at." He realized what he had done. I didn't say that. You literally just did. He started telling me to call him later when I had calmed down. I hung up. Then I opened my laptop and downloaded my transfer history. I knew the rough amounts, obviously. I had lived with them for 11 years. But there is a difference between knowing something monthly and seeing it stretched across more than a decade. 3 years at $1,800 a month was $64,800. 8 years at $2,800 a month was $268,800. Total recurring support, $333,600. That didn't include occasional one-off help, a medical bill here, a repair there, a couple of larger holiday transfers when I knew they were tight. I deliberately didn't add those in. I didn't want to inflate the number because I was angry. So I sat there looking at $333,600. I didn't feel like I had been robbed of every dollar. That wouldn't have been true. I knew some of that money had paid Dad's real medical bills. I knew some had covered their real mortgage. I knew there had been years when they honestly needed help. What bothered me was that I suddenly had no idea when that stopped being the arrangement. The next thing I did was look up the duplex. I had the address because Spencer had sent it to me years earlier when he moved in. The public property record confirmed that Spencer had been the owner for about 5 years. That alone didn't prove anything about my money. It just confirmed the property was his. So I called Celia. I asked her about the comment she had made years earlier, the one about my parents no longer having a mortgage. She went quiet. Then she said, "Daisy, I thought you knew." Knew what? Your mother used most of Grandma's inheritance to pay off the house. When? About 6 years ago. I felt something in my chest sink. Completely paid off? Yes. And you're sure? Yes. Irene told me herself. She was relieved. Celia paused. Then she said, "Why are you asking me this now?" I told her only that I was trying to understand some finances. She said, "Are they in trouble again?" I said, "I honestly don't know." That afternoon I called Mom. I asked one question. "When was your mortgage paid off?" She immediately started talking about property taxes. We still have taxes, insurance, utilities, medical expenses. Owning a house is not free. I know. When was the mortgage paid off? We have housing expenses whether there's a mortgage or not. That's not the question I asked. She got quiet. Then she said, "About 6 years ago." I asked why she had told me 2 years earlier that they were barely keeping up with housing when I asked about reducing my support. She said, "Because we were." With what housing? There was another pause. Then she said, "You're making this sound uglier than it was. I'm asking what the money was paying for." Family expenses. What family expenses? You have never put conditions on what you gave us. That was technically true. I had never sent a transfer labeled for mortgage only. I said, "Because you told me you needed it." We did need it. For what? She got upset and said I was treating her like a criminal. I told her I wasn't accusing her of a crime. I was asking what changed after the mortgage was gone. She told me to talk to my father. A few hours later, Dad emailed me a spreadsheet. This might sound almost unbelievable, but the spreadsheet was what actually made everything clearer because Dad sent it to prove they still needed the money. It wasn't some forensic accounting document. It was a basic household budget. Taxes, insurance, utilities, groceries, medical costs, car expenses, a few subscriptions, some discretionary spending, and then one line near the bottom, Spencer property gap, $1,150. I stared at it. Then I called Dad. "What is Spencer property gap?" He answered like the term itself was obvious. "The duplex." "What about it?" "We help him cover the difference when the rent doesn't meet the property costs. So you send him $1,150 a month. Usually around there. It varies. From the money I send you. Daisy, money is pooled. It doesn't work like you're describing it." I said, "Then describe it." He told me Spencer's rental unit usually brought in around $1,400 to $1,500 a month when occupied, but mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and vacancies meant there were gaps. I asked how long they had been covering those gaps. "On and off since he bought it." "And the down payment?" He hesitated. "That was separate." "How much?" "We helped him." "How much?" "About 75. 7,500? 75,000. I actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because my brain needed somewhere to put the number. I said, "You gave Spencer $75,000 for a down payment and kept taking $2,800 a month from me. It wasn't like we took your $2,800 and handed it to him. Then where did the $1,150 come from?" He sounded annoyed. "You're reducing everything to buckets." "Yes, because I want to know which bucket I was filling." He said, "You were stable." He was trying to build something. "With my money?" "With family money." That was the sentence that changed the whole thing for me. Not because it was the cruelest thing anyone said. It wasn't. It was because I realized Dad no longer thought of my transfer as my money at all. Once it entered their account in his mind, it became a family resource that he and Mom had the right to distribute according to who needed what. I asked, if it was family money, why was I the only one earning it? He told me that was an unfair way to frame it. I said, "I'm not framing anything. I'm asking whether I knew I was funding Spencer." "You knew we helped your brother." "I knew you helped him. I didn't know I was helping him through you." "You were doing well." "He wasn't." "That still doesn't answer the question," Dad said. "We were trying to get both of you somewhere stable." I said, "I was already stable." "That's exactly why you could help." There it was again. My stability wasn't the reason I needed less. It was the reason they thought I owed more. I called Spencer next. He sounded defensive before I even finished asking the first question. "Mom said you're freaking out." "I'm asking what you knew." "About what?" "The money Mom and Dad give you for the duplex." "They offered." "I didn't ask if you forced them." He was quiet. I asked, "Did you know I was sending them $2,800 every month?" "Yes." "Did you know they were using part of that money to cover your property?" He hesitated. "I knew they helped me out when they could." "That's not the question. You're doing the same thing Dad says you're doing. You're pretending every dollar has your name on it." "Did you know I thought the money was for Mom and Dad?" He sighed. Then he said, "You were fine sending it before you knew where it went." That was the worst thing he could have said. I said, "Correct." He didn't answer. I said, "That is exactly the problem." He tried to walk it back. He said Mom and Dad had offered. He said he wasn't living some luxury life. He said the duplex didn't print money. He told me about a roof repair, a vacancy insurance going up. I believed all of that. None of it answered whether I had agreed to subsidize his asset. I asked him, if Mom and Dad had told me 5 years ago, "We no longer have a mortgage, but we want you to keep sending the same amount so we can help Spencer build equity," what do you think I would have said? He didn't answer directly. He said, "I don't know." I said, "Yes, you do." Then he said, "They were trying to make things fair." Fair to who? To both of us. I ended the call before I said something I would regret. That night I told Ben everything. The paid-off mortgage. The $75,000 down payment. The $1,150 monthly property gap. Dad calling my transfer family money. Spencer's comment. Ben listened. Then he said, "Do you want me to say what I think? Or do you want me to just listen tonight?" I told him to say it. He took a second. "I never asked you to abandon them." "I know." I asked whether the agreement was still the agreement. I looked down at the table. He said, "I stopped bringing it up because every time I asked, you acted like I was asking you to choose me over them." I started to defend myself automatically. Then I stopped. Because he was right. Not about everything, but about that. For years, I had treated the subject as off-limits. I had decided that because the money came from what we could afford, nobody else was allowed to question the arrangement. Except it was our household too. Ben had never tried to cut off my parents. He had asked for transparency, and I had made transparency sound cruel. That wasn't something my parents did to my marriage. I did that. The next day I wrote my parents a message. I told them I wasn't restarting the monthly transfer. I also told them I didn't want to put them into an immediate crisis if they had legitimate bills they could not cover. So for the next 60 days, if they had a medical bill, utility bill, insurance expense, or another essential cost they truly couldn't pay, They could send me the bill and I would consider helping with it directly. No cash transfer. No money that could be moved to Spencer. No co-signing. No covering a duplex shortfall. Dad called it humiliating. Mom called it controlling. She said, "You're going to make your father send you proof every time we need help?" I said, "Yes, if you want me to pay it. We are your parents." "I know. We should not have to justify groceries to you." "Then don't ask me to buy the groceries." She got angry and hung up. They refused the 60-day arrangement. For about a week I heard nothing. Then the family calls started. A cousin told me Mom had said I cut off my own parents overnight after 11 years. An older relative told me I needed to think about everything my parents had done for me. Someone else said, "You know your dad has medical issues." Nobody mentioned Spencer. Nobody mentioned the duplex. Nobody mentioned that my parents' house had been mortgage-free for years. First, I didn't explain. I just said, "There is more to the story." That didn't help. To some people, refusing to explain sounded like guilt. Then Mom called me and gave me the full version of her argument. "We never kept score when you were a child." I said nothing. "We never sent you an invoice for 18 years. I still said nothing. She said, "We fed you, clothed you, gave you everything we could. And now you want to turn this family into an accounting exercise." That finally got me. I said, "Then why are you talking like I've been paying an invoice?" She said, "That is not what I meant. You keep telling people I'm ungrateful. Ungrateful means you think I owe you. You owe your family loyalty. I gave you $333,600 in recurring support." There was silence. I had never said the total to her before. Then she said, "You calculated it?" "Yes." That is disgusting. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I thought the number was sacred, but because she made the act of counting my own money sound like a betrayal. I said, "If you never kept score, stop telling me what I owe." She hung up again. A few days later, Dad asked to meet me alone. He was calmer than Mom. That is usually his style. He can make something sound reasonable just by lowering his voice. He said the arrangement had evolved over time. I said, "Without me." He said, "Not intentionally. How does a financial arrangement evolve without telling the person funding it?" He rubbed his forehead. Then he explained what he and Mom had apparently been telling themselves for years. Spencer needed a start. I didn't. Spencer had struggled. I had a stable marriage, a home, savings, and a child. They had resources. I had resources. They wanted both of their children to have something secure. Then he said, "You'll probably get the house someday anyway." I stared at him. "What?" He said he and Mom had talked about leaving their house to me because Spencer had the duplex. Nothing formal, apparently. No promise made to me. Just something they had discussed. That was their balancing plan. Spencer gets help building equity now. Daisy keeps subsidizing Mom and Dad. Daisy maybe gets the house later. I said, "Did I agree to buy my inheritance 1 month at a time?" Dad looked genuinely taken aback. "I never thought of it that way. I wasn't buying an inheritance. That's not what I said. It's what you're using to justify this." He told me they were trying to be fair. I asked him, "Fairness to you means I send money now because I might inherit something later?" "No." "Then leave the inheritance out of it." He didn't have a clean answer after that. I asked him one more time how much of Spencer's down payment came from my transfers. He said he couldn't tell me. That part I believe. The money had been pooled. My parents had savings, Mom's inheritance, ordinary income, and my monthly transfer going through the same financial life. There was no labeled envelope showing my exact share of the $75,000. And that mattered to me because I didn't want to invent certainty where there was none. I could prove what I had sent. I could prove when their mortgage had ended. I could prove Spencer owned the duplex. Dad's own budget showed the monthly property gap. Spencer himself admitted he knew my parents were helping him, and that I didn't know the details. But there was no magical document saying, "Daisy paid exactly X dollars of Spencer's down payment." I didn't need one. The problem wasn't tracing individual bills. The problem was that my parents' need had changed and nobody gave me the chance to reconsider my choice. Around then, Celia called me. She said she had spoken to Mom and Dad and had also spoken to Spencer. She started with, "I was told you cut them off without warning. I stopped a voluntary transfer after finding out it was partly funding Spencer's property. I know that now." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I also didn't know they were still taking that much from you." That was the first time I heard her sound less certain that I was overreacting. She still didn't fully take my side. She said canceling the transfer without speaking to them first was abrupt. I said, "That's fair." She said the direct bill arrangement could feel demeaning. I said, "Also fair." Then I asked what she thought I should do instead. She said, "I think all of you need to sit in the same room and stop telling separate versions." So she arranged a family dinner. It wasn't the whole extended family, but it included my parents, Spencer, Celia, Ben, and a few relatives who had already been pulled into the situation. Beforehand, I told Celia one thing. If anybody calls me ungrateful at that table, I'm saying the amount. She said, "Daisy, I'm serious. That will embarrass your parents. So will telling people I abandoned them." Mom heard about that condition and called it a threat. I called it a warning. The dinner started badly. Mom began by saying she wanted us to stop turning family help into an accounting exercise. Spencer agreed. Dad mostly stayed quiet. Mom said, "We helped both of you differently because you needed different things." I said, "With whose money?" She said, "There you go again." Celia asked everyone to stop talking over each other. Mom said I was acting like she and Dad had stolen from me. I said, "I have not used the word stolen. You calculated 11 years of support." Yes. Normal people do not do that to their parents. I looked at Celia. She gave me a look that basically said, "You warned me." So I took out my phone. I didn't bring a folder. I didn't print bank statements. I had a few dates and numbers in my notes because I didn't trust myself to remember them accurately once everyone started arguing. I said, "I started helping 11 years ago when Dad got sick. 3 years at $1,800 a month. Then 8 years at $2,800. That's about $333,600 in recurring transfers. I'm not including extra one-off help." One relative actually said, "300 what?" Mom's face changed. I kept going. The original reason was mortgage, medical costs, and basic living expenses. About 6 years ago, Mom used Grandma's inheritance to pay off the mortgage. I was not told. 5 years ago, Mom and Dad helped Spencer buy the duplex. Dad told me the down payment was around $75,000. Dad's current budget shows about $1,150 a month going to Spencer as a property gap. Spencer said, "You're making it sound like I'm pocketing cash." I didn't say that. "You know the property has expenses." Yes. "You always said the money was for the family." I looked at him. I said it was for Mom and Dad because they told me they needed it. He said, "So now you want them to sell things because you changed your mind?" No. "You're acting like they have to choose between us." No. "I want them to pay for their choices with their money." Mom said, "That is such a cold way to talk about your brother." Celia cut in. She looked at Dad and asked, "Are the main numbers wrong?" Dad said nothing at first. Celia repeated it. "Is she wrong about the mortgage being paid off 6 years ago?" No. "Is she wrong about the duplex being bought 5 years ago?" No. "Is she wrong about the $75,000? He said, "Approximately." "Is she wrong that you send Spencer money for the property gap?" No. Celia asked, "Did Daisy know?" Mom answered for him. "She knew we helped Spencer." "That isn't what I asked." Celia looked back at Dad. "Did Daisy know that the same monthly support she thought was for your household was helping cover Spencer's duplex?" Dad stared at the table. Finally he said, "Not in those terms." Celia said, "What terms did she know it in?" Nobody answered. Spencer tried again. He said, "I don't get why everyone is acting like Mom and Dad did something insane. Daisy was doing fine. I was trying to get on my feet." I said. You were building equity in a property. Yeah, because I was trying to create something. I'm not criticizing you for buying it. You clearly are. No. I'm criticizing the part where my monthly transfer helped make your numbers work and nobody told me. He said. Mom and Dad offered. I didn't force them. Celia said. Helping one child with the other child's money is not the same as helping both. Spencer looked furious. Dad finally spoke more directly. He said. We did not see it as her money versus our money. Daisy was doing well. Spencer wasn't. We were trying to use the resources available to us to help both children end up stable. Celia asked. Was Daisy one of those resources? Dad didn't answer immediately. That pause was the closest thing to an admission anyone needed. Mom said. You're all twisting this. I said. No, I think we are finally saying it clearly. Dad looked at me and said. I didn't think you would see the money as separate once it was given. I said. I wouldn't have cared if you bought dinner with it instead of groceries. I care that the reason you gave me for continuing the transfer was that you were barely keeping up. Mom said. We were. With a property I didn't know I was subsidizing. She said. Your brother needed a chance. I said. Then you could have asked me if I wanted to help give him one. That was the whole issue. Not whether Spencer deserved help. Not whether my parents were allowed to spend money on him. Not whether parents can treat children differently depending on need. They made the decision for me because they assumed my answer should be yes. At the dinner, I told them my final boundary. I wasn't asking for $333,600 back. I wasn't suing anyone. I wasn't asking my parents to sell their house. I wasn't asking Spencer to hand me the duplex. I was not going to contact his tenant, drag his finances into public, or involve anyone outside the family. But the monthly allowance was over. I would not co-sign anything. I would not cover a future property gap. If Mom and Dad wanted to keep supporting Spencer, they were free to do it with their money. If they had a real medical or essential expense and wanted to ask me for help, they could ask. But I was done with blind funding. Mom said, So you're putting us on an allowance? I said, no, I'm ending one. That line came out sharper than I intended, and I could tell it embarrassed her. Celia later told me that was one of the moments where she thought I had gone too far. She also told me I had every right to stop the transfer. Both things can be true. The family dinner fixed the false version of the story, but it did not fix the family. A few relatives apologized to me afterward. A couple did not. One told me my parents were wrong, but saying the exact total in front of everyone was designed to humiliate them. Maybe it was partly. I had been accused of abandoning my parents after 11 years, and I wanted the scale of those 11 years understood. I'm not going to pretend I announced $333,600 in a purely neutral spirit. I was defending myself and I was angry. Mom stopped speaking to me for several weeks. Dad stayed in contact, but our calls became short and practical. Spencer barely spoke to me at all. When he did, he said I had pulled the ladder up after getting myself secure. I told him the ladder he was describing had apparently been attached to my checking account. He didn't find that funny. The financial consequences were much less dramatic than some relatives predicted. My parents did not lose their home. They still had it mortgage-free. They cut back on discretionary spending. Dad reviewed some bills. Mom complained to Celia that they were suddenly having to think about things they hadn't thought about in years. Which I realized was exactly what had happened to me in reverse. For years, the $2,800 left my account automatically, so they had stopped experiencing it as help. It had become infrastructure. Spencer had a harder time. Without my parents making up the duplex shortfall as often, he had to use the rent from the other unit for the property first instead of treating some of it as flexible income. He covered more of the mortgage himself. A repair hit a few months later that was expensive enough to cause real stress. He blamed me. I reminded him that I had never owned any part of the property, never received rent, never shared in the equity, and never agreed to guarantee its cash flow. He said, I know. I just think you could have handled this differently. I said, so do I. That surprised him enough that he stopped talking for a second. Because there are parts one would handle differently. I might have asked Mom about the birthday comment before canceling the transfer. I might have kept the exact total out of the family dinner if she had not been telling people I abandoned them. I definitely should have listened to Ben years earlier when he asked basic questions. But none of those things would make me restart the arrangement. About 5 months after the birthday dinner, Spencer sold the duplex. I didn't force him to. I couldn't have forced him to. He decided the numbers were not worth it once he was carrying the full cost of the property himself. He didn't walk away with nothing. He had equity. He sold, paid what needed to be paid, and kept what remained. What he lost was not his entire future. He lost a financial setup that only worked because somebody else was quietly absorbing part of the downside. Our relationship is polite now, not warm. He still thinks I pulled support at the worst possible time. I still think it's revealing that he calls it support from me now, when before he insisted it was simply my parents helping him. Mom eventually started speaking to me again, but things never returned to normal. For a while, every conversation had a careful space in the middle where money used to be. She never gave me some big apology. Dad didn't either. The closest he got was once saying, "We should have told you when the mortgage was paid." I said, "Yes." That was it. Celia still believes I was right about the money and wrong about making the total public at dinner. I can live with that judgment. The biggest repair happened at home with Ben. A few weeks after the family dinner, we sat down and made a rule for both sides of our family. Large recurring support does not happen unless both of us know what it is for, how long it is expected to last, and when we will review it. That rule applies to my relatives and his. It's not about needing permission to buy someone dinner or help with an emergency. It's about not creating another permanent financial obligation by accident. I apologized to him for the way I had treated his questions. He told me he was sorry that sometimes he had talked about family support so clinically that I heard judgment where he meant caution. Neither of us got to be completely right. Nora never got pulled into the details. She only noticed that I called Grandma less for a while. I wasn't going to make an 8-year-old pick a side in an adult money fight. 9 months after Mom's birthday, Dad texted me a photo. It was a medical bill. Not a vague message saying they were short. Not a request for $2,800. An actual bill. He wrote, "Can you help with part of this?" Mom didn't call first. She didn't remind me who raised me. She didn't mention what family means. Dad just asked. I showed the bill to Ben. We talked about it. We decided on an amount we were comfortable with, and I paid that amount directly to the provider. For 11 years, money had left my account every month without me touching anything. By the end, the absence of thought had started to feel like proof that the arrangement was normal. This time I typed in the amount myself. I checked the recipient. I looked at the number one more time. Then I hit send. I still help my parents. I just no longer confuse being able to help with agreeing to everything they decide to do with the help. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.